in 3, 2, 1. The Thurgood Marshall College Fund writes in 2024 that, quote, major policies require Congress, but executive orders influence the internal affairs of government, deciding how and what degree legislation will be enforced, and in general fine-tuning policy, unquote. When evaluating the benefits and harms of executive orders, we urge the judges to focus on how the system as a whole functions, rather than only on individual examples, as there are checks in place with the states, courts, and Congress. Just as we wouldn't call Congress on balance harmful for passing some bad laws, we can dismiss executive orders for the same. Thus, we affirm for our sole contention of a systemic necessity. Subpoint A is design. Congress is structured to be slow. Indiana University in 2023 explains that Congress not only is not designed for quick action, but structured to slow things down so that matters of national importance can get a careful look, end quote. This slowness underscores the need for swift policy action, which comes from the executive. Samosky 25 concludes, the founders left executive power broadly defined so the president can act in whatever situation that might arise. The broad nature does not mean unlimited, end quote. So point B is crisis. Duncan 10 finds that executive orders respond to urgent national needs, as in wartime, post-war reconstruction, and disasters. If the president must wait for Congress, it could render the country vulnerable to considerable harm. Nevertheless, Congress may act when it feels like the president overstepped, end quote. We saw this feat empirically solve crises multiple times. One example was the bank holiday. The Federal Reserve in 2015 corroborates that Roosevelt ordered the suspension of all banking transactions in 1933. Holders of U.S. currency were rapidly losing faith in paper money and redeeming dollars at an alarming rate. The bank holiday would permit the country to calm down and allow time for legislation, and the crisis began to subside only 4 days after, quote. Without this use of the executive order, our country wouldn't be the same. Selgin 20 finds that the banking holiday marked the turning point of the Great Depression. As the banks reopened, a recovery began that wouldn't have been possible had the public not been convinced not only to quit withdrawing their money, but to start putting it back. Without this intervention, America's entire banking system would have collapsed, extending the Great Depression indefinitely and affecting the lives of 125 million Americans. Another major example is public health emergencies. During COVID, Biden's orders were fundamental to saving Americans. Morris 21. Biden's national strategy for COVID includes executive orders and totals 200 pages. Biden issued the executive order to provide a unified and effective response, which established a national response structure to coordinate across the federal government, end quote. As a result, the American Presidency Project in 2025 concludes, the national strategy mobilized 90,000 vaccination locations and achieved 200 million vaccines in 100 days, end quote. Crisis response will always be imperative for our nation in saving our citizens, and executive orders are not just instrumental in achieving that, but the only way to do so. Subpoint C is cooperation. Civics for Life No Gate explains that executive orders set the tone for national debate, shape public policy, and put pressure on Congress to act, end quote. As a result, Stratton 24 concludes that civil rights executive orders from Eisenhower and Truman were executed in tandem with congressional legislation. The friction and cooperation they generate serve as a testament to the American system of governance, which balances strong leadership with necessary restraint. They exemplify the balance of power envisioned by the Founding Fathers and sustain our constitutional republic, end quote. Our impact is the system. Ray Nodate finds that executive orders are the primary tools for the management and mobilization of the federal government, end quote. This is why Slomowski 25 concludes that government is ineffective unless there is a strong enough executive to ensure the government is well administered, end quote. This comes before anything else, as it is key to the rights and security of our nation's citizens, as Smith 16 concludes, that governance is a critical precursor to peace and security. Failed states, by contrast, do not have the institutions that foster good governance. As such, they are breeding grounds for war and insecurity. Efforts to secure peace and security require governance first and foremost, end quote. Without functioning governance through directing agencies, fine-tuning policies, speed in crisis, and friction between branches, no rights, peace, or progress can exist. Because those values come before all else, we are proud to affirm.
Okay, do you want me to send cards or like the rhetoric I'm reading? I can send everything actually. No, I'll send it. Yeah. All right, everyone's ready? Just to reiterate, we are we're the neg. We're the con, speak code 103. Everyone's ready? In Federalist 51, James Madison warned that the concentration of legislative and executive powers in a single person is the very definition of tyranny. At the heart of American democracy is the separation of powers, checks and balances designed to prevent domination by any one branch. Presidents were never meant to make laws, only to enforce them. Yet, executive orders move us closer to the danger Madison feared, enabling a single person to act as a judge, jury, and executioner. In any governed society, laws and regulations will always exist, whether created by Congress, the president, or an individual state. The real debate focuses not only on whether specific policy actions were good or bad, but rather whether executive orders as a tool for legislation uphold the democratic principles that America was built on. Because we believe the unchecked executive power erodes the foundation of our Constitution, democracy, thus. 1038 is proud to negate, resolved, on balance, in the United States, the benefits of presidential executive orders outweigh the harms. Contention 1 is a policy pendulum. Executive orders create instability and undermine durable governance. Dan Bosch of American Action Forum explains in 2021 that executive orders are easily reversed between administrations, turning federal policy into a political ping-pong match. He finds that presidents now spend more time undoing their predecessors than legislating for the future. For example, Trump reversed Obama-era orders on immigration and climate policy, and in turn, Biden reversed over 100 of Trump's orders in his first year alone. And now, Trump has once again done the same thing to Biden. Bosch concludes that this whiplash destroys long-term policymaking, allowing a single person to abruptly change the political direction of our entire country on critical issues like the economy and the environment. The first is economics. NYU economist Simon Gilchrist explains in 2014 that the erratic policy shifts tank consumer and investor confidence, triggering decline in wages, output, and long-term growth. In 2025, Danielle Costa of the American Policy finds that Trump's revocation of Biden's order that guaranteed union protections created living wages for 390,000 workers and expanded apprenticeships. But this has already worsened economic productivity and triggered a decline toward a recession. The second is climate. Bosch finds that emissions reductions require multi-decade commitments, which are rendered impossible under volatile executive action. Each new administration reset national targets, such as Trump's withdrawal from Paris climate accords in both terms, delaying progress and increasing the risk of climate catastrophe. Contention 2 is no case. Executive orders concentrate legislative power in a single person by violating democratic norms and creating two really key dangers. The first is bypassing Congress. Michelle Belko of the University of Houston finds in 2011 that presidents increasingly sidestep Congress to impose major policy changes unilaterally. Rather than democratically debate, policies are crafted unilaterally, threatening the separation of powers. Piper Holliday of Ohio State University finds in 2022 that executive orders are instantaneous and unvetted, unlike laws which must pass through rigorous debate, amendment, and bipartisan scrutiny, ultimately concluding that the harms of executive orders outweigh the benefits. Law professor Rehan Sune explains in 2012 that public debate is our best safeguard against tyranny. Without it, the policymaking reflects not only the will of the people, but the rash action of one man, eroding the very foundations of democracy. The second is a lack of accountability in second-term presidents. Belko warns that because second-term presidents face no electoral check, they're far likely to act unilaterally. Mahawardeh finds in 2025 that Trump has exploited this immunity by issuing sweeping orders like revoking birthright citizenship and deporting college students. She argues that this signals a presidency driven not by the rule of the law, but by personal vision. The result is a collapse in public trust. Interviews at the Washington University find in 2015 that 73% of Americans oppose unilateral action. This is real-world impacts, as Jonathan Perry of the UN explained in 2021 that public trust is essential to managing pandemics, fighting climate change, and reducing poverty.
Yeah, it'll take a few seconds to go.
Go, sir. How do you stand or sit? I can stand. All right, you spoke first.
You said that executive orders have led to democratic decline, but if we had executive orders since the start of our nation, meaning George Washington even passed one himself, When will democracy go away because of an executive order?
Okay, our argument is not that democracy is going to suddenly be erased tomorrow because Trump passes 6 executive orders. Our argument is really simple. Specifically, on our second argument of public trust, we tell you that public trust is crucial to democracies, but our evidence isolates that over 73% of Americans do not approve of unilateral action, which are executive orders.
Can I follow?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
How much of, so this is a really weird thing. How many executive orders have led to democracy getting worse to public trust getting worse?
No,
how
we
much
just
of
said that the
democracy-
usage of executive orders decreases public trust because people
How much?
feel like it's at 73%, what I just said.
No, that's just 73% don't like executive orders. How much does public trust decrease when an executive order is passed?
Like, no study is going to isolate that specifically, but that actually doesn't matter because our argument is hindered on the fact that the public doesn't like unilateral action. I think that's our link evidence. It's really, really clear. Okay, let's specifically go to your argument about cooperation.
Yeah.
If executive orders didn't exist, would there still be cooperation between the executive branch and the legislative branch?
Two things. First, we can't even ask that question because executive orders have been a part of our nation for the entire history. We don't know what would happen without them. But what is for sure wouldn't happen without them is the government function. Our regulated evidence finds that they're the primary tools to manage the government. Their legal definition are formal instructions to direct federal agencies. Without any direction from these federal agencies, we can't control the bureaucracy, meaning our government wouldn't even exist. Cooperation wouldn't even matter without it.
Okay, any question?
Sure. You say, you talk about how there's whiplash and reversals, but you're talking about Trump and Biden and recent administrations. But if there's a Cambridge 24 card that we're going to read in rebuttal, which finds that 75% of all executive orders have never been reversed, why is this indicative or important to the system
Because-
and enough for the judges for on balance to make it?
Specifically, our 2 impacts of the argument are really clear. An NYU economist isolates that when we have economic policy change so swiftly, it actually leads to a downturn economy because investor confidence decreases, right? Because policy changes so much. But secondly, climate change is a real problem. I think we can all agree with that. But when you have every 4 years administrations changing policy so rashly, like Bush was really against climate change and Obama was really for climate change, we see a large difference in policy. And in order to solve climate change and actually help the problem, sure, go ahead.
That really answers my question. If 75% of all executive orders are never revoked, I understand that's a problem now, but why is it?
Yeah,
not
the
for
ones that
judges-
are revoked are the ones that are on climate change and economy. That's
Well,
what I just said.
all 25% of the executive orders that are revoked are only on
Like the Paris Climate Accord, there's a bunch of examples of Trump and even George Bush pulling out of climate, Republican presidents, right? They don't believe in climate change, they don't want to that's just. Okay, you tell me in your, I think, subpoint B about COVID-19, but you list me examples of President Biden. When did COVID start?
In 2020.
So what actions were, if you're telling me we're addressing crisis really, really soon,
Yeah.
but President Biden took office in 2021, what happened the rest of 2020?
Two things. One, in 2020, Trump did sign an executive order to do a handle COVID, but two, Biden signed the executive order the day he got into office. That's the quickest anyone could ever do it. Their first day of presidency. That's why it was quick action, and he got 200 million vaccines.
We all don't believe in climate change. They gotta turn the weather machine off, bro. Climate change is big. It's all the scientists who are, it's all made up.
This is going to just going down in topics. So everybody ready? We'll start in 3, 2. I'm just gonna. Okay. Just gonna have. We'll start in 3, 2.
The government must run. To the point they read you Federalist 51 by James Madison, warning against the dissolution of the United States into tyranny. But then, in James Madison's own administration, he used executive orders. You realize that they're necessary to create government function. That's always where you affirm, because to the point where James Madison, speaking out against generating tyranny, used executive orders in his own administration, you always know that systematically they're necessary for the United States to run. But then, they tell you that we're moving really, really close to tyranny. But while the president's power has grown, so has the checks. Peterson 19 writes, quotes, while presidents today may hold more power than they did when the Constitution was written, the powers of institutions that have the ability to curb them have grown as well. What we see, fundamentally, is that the institutions fighting back against the executive powers have grown in tandem. We're not getting closer to tyranny. That's why for 250 years of American history, we've never had a dictator, and we never will. Let's go on to their first contention of the policy pendulum. There's four main responses. They tell you that on balance, policy gets reversed. Realize they're only talking about as recent as the Obama administration. Cambridge University writes in 2024 that only 75% of executive orders have never been revoked, meaning only 1/4 of them totally are reversed. Make them tell you why, on balance, through 200 years of American history, this matters at all. It doesn't. Mainly because of the second response. They give you no inclination that this trend will continue into the future. It could all end up here with Trump until they prove to you that this trend is going to last forever, which it won't. You never vote for them. But thirdly, on both of their impacts on the economy and on the Paris Climate Accords, they give you no number telling you how much these executive order reversals are contributing to economic decline or how many emissions they're increasing. Fundamentally, what we see is we pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord in 2017, and we're still on track to solve climate change after we went back in. So what we know is that they don't have any specific link because none of their evidence gives you any specific numbers to anything. On that, you can never weigh this to contention at all. But fourthly, what we see is there's good and bad on both sides. At two ends of a pendulum, there's a midpoint in the middle. They have nothing to weigh because for every bad policy, there's a good one passed. Look to Biden, who mobilized our federal government to stop climate change and made all agencies accountable. Look to the Carter administration, who bolstered our EPA to set the regulations that we have today. You always know that on both sides, there's good and bad. That's why we need to look at the system, not specific reversals. Let's go into their C2 with no opinions. There's four main responses. Firstly, realize that checks and balances have grown. They're going to talk about President Trump and how evil and malevolent he is, but look to the fact that checks are still checking, not just with our Peterson 19 evidence, but right now. Nuts in 25 reads, quote, Trump is getting crushed in the lower courts with losing 96% of his total federal rulings. Right now, the Trump administration is getting checked. That's because executive orders are a cohesive part of our system and necessary for it to function. It's not an unprecedented threat. But secondly, they tell you that they were losing public trust with these executive orders. But right now, there's no trust in Congress. The Pew Research Center in 2023 says that 3/4 or more say that Congress do a very bad job at listening to the concerns of their people in their districts. There's no trust in the government. Government-wide, it's not just the executive. It's not the order. Thirdly, they tell you that Trump is going to do all these bad things. So remember, he's getting checked right now in the status quo, not just by the courts, but by states and by Congress and by the markets when he rescinded his tariffs because the markets freaked out. What we see is they're telling you that we're going to have an autocracy, we're going to lose democracy, but make them tell you what that means instead of full-blown dictatorship, which we've never seen happen before. Which is the fourth response. We see that executive orders are part of our system, being used by James Madison, the very person they used to indict tyranny, because they're necessary to run the government, to run the bureaucracy, to fine-tune policy, to provoke Congress into action, and ultimately to act in crisis. You always vote F because they're so necessary.
Before I go, could I see the piece of evidence that there's no trust in Congress?
Yeah, don't you just accept all of this?
Yeah, I can just.
I mean, it's fine.
That's Ina's thing too.
Okay, that was 11 seconds. I'll be continuing today. the order of my speech would just be going over their recent speech and defending our case and then going straight down their case. Oh, yeah. Do you guys mind doing
Yeah, you can use it. It's a little.
this? Looks like all
Okay,
this is-
wait, guys, wait. The bottom's like not right, but we can still start.
Oh, that one's.
Okay.
I'm gonna buy this guy, so I'm not your
It's okay. 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 Is everyone good? In response to our arguments, they give you a few responses. First, at the top, they tell you that checks have grown, and they cite this evidence from 2019. What you have to understand is that these checks have grown since 2019, then we wouldn't see Trump overturning judicial reviews, rulings, and not getting Aurelio Garcia from Guantanamo Bay, from El Salvador. We wouldn't see these bad things happening if these checks were better. And let's say these checks are better. Even if these checks are better, that means that they're never going to be as good as checking back against the abuses that executive orders allow presidents to do. But then they say this 75% has never been revoked. What they haven't understood is that the warrant is perceptual. Once the investors feel that every time a new president comes in, there's going to be different amounts or different types of policies, they're going to stop investing in things and consumers are going to stop buying. That's what our study from 40 years from the New York University economist finds. It's not just if the reversal happens, it's because the reversal has happened, it's led to this perception that it will. But then, they say that there's no guarantee that Trump is going to do this in the future. We would argue that him being an anomaly sets a precedent for the future. Him doing all these bad things makes other people believe that it's going to keep happening, and other presidents, it's going to reveal their actual power. Then, at the end of their response to the first argument, they say that for every good policy, there's a bad one. That is exactly our argument. We're not here to argue whether the policies are good or bad, but the mechanism by which those policies are getting passed, and we would argue that the reversibility of those is inherently bad for the economy and for climate. Now, in response to our second argument, we have a few responses. They use this card about how there's no trust in Congress. It doesn't matter. The evidence is saying that people believe Congress doesn't do anything. That's completely different than people not wanting the president to have unilateral action. Their evidence doesn't say that we don't want Congress to pass legislation. That's completely different. But then they said that there's like no way for us, for no impact because we're not losing democracy. That's not true. We see people not voting because they don't have trust in the government because they think, oh, it's fine, I don't need to vote. Now, let's go to their arguments. At the top, they tell you about how our Congress is slow. Our Bosch 21 evidence finds that although executive orders seem more faster and more efficient, in the long term, they're less fast and less efficient because they're getting reversed. All the progress they're doing is for the mass time frame of at least 8 to 4 years. But we would argue, what the evidence indicates is that when Congress passes a bill, even if the frequency is lower, the bills are longer, which means that Congress is doing more with one bill than an executive order does. Now, let's move on to this crisis argument. A few key problems here. First, realize that crisis can be solved with the National Emergency Act. What this does is the president is allowed to call for an emergency and pass proclamations, which are different from executive orders, which gives them 120 powers that are given to them by Congress that allows them to do things. This is why we did stuff during COVID. We didn't do it fully under executive orders. No, we had an emergency, and President Trump declared an emergency under COVID. That's why we had the ability to go against this. Why is this better than executive orders? Because the powers are not unlimited, and they're set by Congress, and also Congress can overturn some things by using 2/3 majority, so there are better checkbacks. Now, on this last argument about cooperation, I really don't understand it. Ask yourself, what cooperation between the legislative branch and the executive branch doesn't only exist because of executive orders. That is a silly claim. The reason it exists, and let's look to their Stratton evidence. It says that the reason that cooperation exists is because there's friction and cooperation between the two branches. It never says that that goes away because of executive orders. And when you're asking yourself, what is the impact of their case? Look to their Smolsky evidence. It says nothing about executive orders. It says that just a strong executive branch is needed to ensure that the laws are enforced consistently and effectively. That happens with or without an executive orders, which means that when you're looking to their side, you don't actually know if there's an impact. I'm good for cross.
Alright. Let's talk
about this like Trump El Salvador thing, he talked about like him not returning Kilmar Abreu Garcia from El Salvador. But to the point that wasn't an executive order, like how can we indict executive orders because of this when we see 96% of his EOs get checked?
Okay, first of all, it was a product of his executive order, and it was a product of his executive order, like it was an outcome of it, and the judicial branch like ruled it that he should return him, and he didn't, which proves that checks and balances don't work with a president that feels that they have so much power, which is a product of having executive orders. But I'll take the question.
I guess so.
Okay. On this, okay, so can you just explain your impact to me?
Yeah, so our impact is essentially the functioning of the government. You missed a couple key warrants here, especially with directing the bureaucracy to take action. We see that like Congress fundamentally does not have the power to do this in the way that the executive does. The executive can act quickly to direct the bureaucracy to take action. And again, these federal agencies are really, really
But
important
we've
all
seen,
across the board.
but I have a question. We've
Yep.
seen the legislative branch act quickly in times when it's really needed,
Yeah,
right?
but,
Like in times of COVID, they're not going to be like, oh, this way is better, and drag it out for months when people are dying. We saw the CARES Act being passed 6 days after COVID was announced as an emergency.
Yeah.
So I really don't understand this point about Congress can't act quickly when we've seen it historically.
So you missed the crux of our answer.
Mhm.
So there's a couple of things. One, it's not always COVID, right? That's a special instance.
Yeah.
You prefer our holistic evidence saying that Congress is designed to act slowly. But two, I was talking about bureaucratic agencies that cannot be governed by the legislation of Congress, or are not like standardly governed and not directed by the laws of Congress. Because the
Right.
executive order is the main tool to instruct bureaucratic agencies. That's what we need to keep our government functioning. That's what we need for like the EPA. That's what we need for all these different agencies that
Okay, but
solve
your
problems.
argument is specific about crises, so
No,
I think
it's
that
not.
we
We
should.
give you 4 warrants. We give
I
you
know,
fine-tuning
your
policy.
second subpoint. Your second subpoint is
Okay.
specifically about crises. So when you're telling me that Congress can't act, and I give you an example of them acting, you can't just say, oh, we should just isolate COVID. No, I think COVID is a great example of a crisis. It's a more recent one, which shows you that the new powers of the legislative branch. But
All right.
you can take the question.
Okay, can I answer that?
Mhm.
So you never implicate, there's a couple things. One, you never implicate what the CARES Act did for COVID. We tell you that the
I can
Biden-
tell you what it is.
We tell you that the Biden executive order got 200 million vaccines and made a national framework that
Right.
Congress then based on.
Biden got that money from the CARES Act, which allowed for Congress to allocate that money to these executive orders, which means that Congress does have the ability to do things if they want to or feel the need to, which happens in crises when people
But
are dying.
when we look at it on balance, we see that Congress is designed to be slow. So one isolated example.
Why are they designed to be slow?
Because they, like you tell us, they need long
Yeah, they're
deliberate
designed to be
legislation.
slower than
Yeah.
executive orders, but
Yeah,
not
that's-
slow in terms of when people are
Okay.
dying, they just sit
So,
there.
so yeah, this is one isolated example. You prefer a holistic evidence that operates when the entire government operates. Because the government just doesn't need to operate during COVID. It needs to operate every single day.
Right, but I'm
because
giving
that's
you
what
an
the
example of
government-
them working during a crisis.
That's one time you
So-
prefer holistics every time.
Wow, that was 1960s. Just the top roadmap, a quick overview at the top, and then go into their case and come back to us. So content. Is that okay? I'll begin in 3, 2. Our opponents are so obsessed with the abstract of executive orders and thinking that they're only used for crisis, but they never respond to our arguments in Marshall 24 evidence that they influence the internal affairs of our government, fine-tune our policies, and direct our federal agencies. Insofar that they give you no evidence or example of anything else that could ever do this, you understand that for our government to function, executive orders are imperative. They never respond to Smith 16, which finds that without governments, there's no peace, security, benefits, or harms, or even a resolution to debates. That's always the most important on balance. Let's go to their subject. They talk about Kilmar Abreu Garcia, one thing that wasn't an executive order, but even if it was, they never explained which one it was. But moreover, this is one example of checks not working. They never respond to the fact that 96% of Trump's executive orders were shot down in the courts. On balance, you're always a going half because the courts actually work. But then, they never respond to Peterson 19. that as long as presidential power grows, the powers to stop the overreach grow as well. This is holistic evidence. They talk about how this is going to increase in the future, but they give you no number, no evidence, or any examples. You rather provide for our real holistic evidence over 250 years worth of history. But the biggest thing they never respond to is the fact that they give you no numbers on how much the economy declines or climate change increases because of executive orders. There's nothing to weigh on their side. But when we get to our side of the flow, we'll give you those numbers back. But then they say that executive orders, we should focus on them as a mechanism. Sure, but the reversals isn't because of the mechanism, it's because of the people who act upon it. But rather, 75% of all of them are never reversed, meaning it isn't indicative of the system, meaning it's not enough for you to on balance negate. But let's go to their second contention. They talk about how public trust in Congress wasn't the same as public trust in the executive. Don't let them misconstrue and lie about our card. It's saying that people don't trust Congress to act upon the things that they want, meaning that public trust is declining across the government. It's not specific to executive orders. But they never respond to the fact that this public trust declining will never lead to a dictatorship because we've had executive orders for 250 years, and the James Madison quote they talk about, he even used it himself. Let's get to our second. They talk about how, sure, the Congress takes slow, but it's long-term bills. We don't have time to wait for long-term bills in crisis. Remember, the only example they gave about Congress acting fast isn't COVID, but we'll get more into that later. They never responded to the bank holiday. And the biggest threat our country has ever faced in the Great Depression, the executive order was the only thing to get us out of it. They never respond to this. That's 125 million Americans you're weighing against no impact they ever extend. But rather, they talk about how the president can have emergencies. But if that were true, then why are they using an executive order? Samosky 25 is clear in saying that they're broadly defined, which does not mean unlimited, so they can use it in whatever situation that might occur. Then they talk about cooperation and how it doesn't make sense. Don't let them just talk about analysis. They give you no evidence saying it doesn't become true. Stratum 24 finds that civil rights executive orders were executed with congressional legislation, meaning that it does work historically. They give you no evidence saying otherwise, and they drop our holistic evidence. The biggest thing they concede is our four warrants on why the government requires executive orders and fine-tuning policy, having true legislation and directing our federal agencies, which are key to peace and security and should always come first, and COVID-19 was always one of them examples.
I think the 96% of this.
Okay, that's fine. That was 6 seconds. We'll see. govern society, laws and regulations will always exist, whether created by Congress, presidents, or individual states. This debate should be focused on the mechanism in which executive orders are used and whether they uphold democratic principles.
That's why we have 2 places to vote in today's round. First, on our argument about no kings. We tell you that executive orders are used for 2 different reasons. First, to bypass Congress. The presidents utilize executive orders to bypass congressional action, which is really bad because Congress is important. Congress does debate to make sure that action is bipartisan. The president doing unilateral action is bypassing that. But secondly, what they miss in this whole entire round is our second warrant. We tell you that presidents during their second term have a lack of accountability. This means because they don't fear re-election, right? It's really, really simple. But they missed that in their last speech. It's cold conceded. They give you 2 responses. First, they tell you about this congressional evidence. It's really simple. You guys can read it if you want. It simply says that people don't like Congress because they don't do anything. That's not the same thing as trust. Our evidence isolates that public trust is 73% of the public doesn't like presidents doing unilateral action. That is very clearly trust their evidence. They're misconstruing it. It's not what it says. But even better, that's even better for our side because that means that when Congress actually does action, people have more trust in them, right? If people are upset that they're not doing action, when we see action being done, we see an increase in trust. We see an increase in trust in Congress specifically. But the second response is that our impact is dictatorship. That's not our impact. Our impact is really clear. Like I just told you, the impact is trust. The importance of trust in the government is really, really important. Our evidence that goes conceded this entire round, Jonathan Perry from the UN tells you that public trust is crucial to managing pandemics, fighting climate change, and reducing poverty. And that goes completely conceded in this entire round. That means that when you abuse executive orders like presidents have done before, we see an erosion of public trust and we see less pushback to fighting problems like climate and like pandemics on their side. This is the second place you can vote for, is on our argument about crises. In their last speech, they tell you that the NEA is different. But first, the NEA is declared by an executive proclamation, which is way different than an executive order. But secondly, what we tell you is that doing executive orders is worse than doing the National Emergency Act for a couple of warrants, which they all miss. First, we tell you it's better because the powers are given by Congress. Congress allocates the 120 powers to the president they can use during times of crises. But secondly, there is checkbacks. There is real checkbacks on powers during emergencies. Congress can actually overturn the emergencies, which they've done before when emergencies are over. But secondly, they can pull back and revoke the president's use of these National Emergency Acts when they feel like it's an overrule. That's why during crises, presidents don't do executive orders. They use the National Emergency Act, which is actually important and actually a system of checks and balances. Again, let's argue about cooperation. We've seen that Congress and the executive branch work together without the use of executive orders. They haven't told you why this is specifically important. It's really clear what you're voting on. That would be perfect.
Cool, if we take the first one?
Go ahead.
Alright. Let's talk about like this emergency thing. If the president can use other powers, like does that matter when the most first used tool and the most widely used tool is the executive order?
Yeah, so the reason that presidents use executive orders is because obviously they have less checkbacks against them. So if I have an executive order, if I have an easier option in front of me, I'm going to use that. When those go away, you ask me a question, I'm going to finish. When those go away, I will be forced to use the things that is more heavily regulated, but also it doesn't fight your argument because it also means that things are getting passed fast because these are already powers set aside to the president by Congress from the past that have accumulated. But Anisha, you can ask the question.
Yeah, okay, let's go specifically to, let's go to our argument about no kings. You tell me in your last speech that your evidence says Congress. Okay, it doesn't say Congress, it says Congress, people don't like Congress. That's what your evidence says.
Our evidence says, quote, 3/4 or more said that Congress do a very bad job of listening to the concerns of people in their district.
That's not the same thing as trust. Nowhere your evidence does it say trust. Our evidence specifically
we
says.
don't need to have trust specifically said. If people don't, if they do a bad job of listening to the concerns of people,
Which means I don't
they
like
don't
Congress.
trust them.
No.
That means they do a
No,
really
if
bad job.
if I'm saying to my partner you're doing a bad job, it means I don't like her, not that I don't trust her.
Okay,
It's not the same thing at all.
but
No, because you don't trust her to do a good
regardless,
job.
the difference between your piece of evidence and ours is it's analyzing the policies passed by Congress. It's not analyzing the mechanism or like the ways that
Wait,
Congress
what
passed.
card do you have this as a policies passed by Congress people trust them?
No, that's not.
Our
One
evidence
second,
says
let
that-
me clarify.
Yeah.
Your evidence is talking about the policies passed by Congress and saying that Congress is doing a bad job.
Yeah.
It's not saying
No,
that the
I'm listening to
mechanism.
the people, not just about
that-
them passing policy.
Okay,
Listening to the
but-
people, meaning they don't trust them to do the things that they elected
Yeah,
them to
but-
do.
There's
That's
a
not
difference
that's
though,
policy.
because
That's
our-
not the mechanism in which Congress
Exactly,
operates.
there's a difference
That's why
between
our
our
This is
basic.
just gonna like puke bigger. Can I take the question?
Sure, go ahead.
You talk a lot about how the NEA is better for pushback, and the reason why presidents look to executive orders is because they can't be controlled as well. So you're telling me that during the bank holiday, when our country was facing the edge of the it's an existential crisis, Roosevelt chose to use an executive order because Congress couldn't check it.
So actually, Congress took a lot of action during the Great
Wait, that's
Depression.
not what I'm asking. Did
But
Roosevelt
yeah,
use an
that's
executive
why
order because there
presidents
wasn't check
on
back?
net don't use.
Yeah, and
No, I'm talking
Roosevelt,
about
a lot of
crisis.
Roosevelt's executive orders actually got overturned because they were unconstitutional.
So the bank
He-
holiday got
because-
overturned?
No,
I
no,
don't know
a lot of his executive
Yeah, he was
orders
in-
got
Wait,
overturned
what
because they were
evidence is this?
unconstitutional.
This
Wait,
is
what
like- this is
evidence is
like
this?
facts.
How
Just
much?
like
How much?
English
That's like
history
facts.
knowledge.
Like a lot of it. A lot
You
of
can't just say that's facts in a debate, right? Like,
A
you need
lot of
evidence and
Roosevelt's
example.
executive
Look at
orders
the
got
line.
overturned because they were
Look at the line.
unconstitutional. That is just a fact.
Yeah.
Okay, but I'm
Like,
saying
his
that,
use of
that okay, this is
executive
just
orders for
messing up.
Japanese and
Wait,
German.
this is missing the premise of my question. In times of crisis, you're telling me that a president chooses to use an executive order because it has less check back.
Yes.
Not because
Yes,
it's
because
quicker
they
and
want to
accurate.
use
Okay,
it.
for
That's-
example,
So they abuse them during when people are
okay,
dying, not
I just
trying to save
have,
them? That's, you can,
I just want to clarify. If a president is using an executive order and it's later getting repealed because it's unconstitutional,
That's during crisis.
obviously that same thing wouldn't have been passed if it was under the
The
emergency
NSDA,
act because
yeah.
they have actual checkbacks.
we use the step back. Pretty sure we have it. So we use 32 and 19. So I can move
Two.
2 more seconds. All right.
Is everybody ready? No cases bogus Madison indicts executive orders, but then he uses them in his administration. You know as a judge that they were necessary for the functioning of our government because someone who hates them like they claim James Madison does actively uses them. That's because they're necessary in our government. This is the link and the impact they never respond. When we see that they're necessary for the functioning of the government, you always vote for the act because the government needs to run before any other benefits can come. On their reversals, they tell you that the recent trends show something, but no they don't. When we see that 75% aren't reversed, you know you have no implication. They have no evidence saying that this trend will stay. They have no evidence from before Obama, you never vote for them here. To the point they have no numbers on their economy or climate change impacts, you never vote for them here. You have nothing to weigh on their side. What you do weigh is the system. They're going to try to tell you democracy is weak, but to the point, they never respond to the fact that in tandem to presidential power, checks and balances have grown more. And just under the current Trump administration, 96% of his abusive orders has been struck down by courts. That's the checks and balances that are effectively working right now. The checks they say don't exist, but the numbers say they do. Then, what we see is that these checks work because they're a cohesive part of our system. Executive orders aren't unprecedented. They've been in our system since the very beginning. What we see is Congress is holistically slow. Don't let them get away with one example. We see EOs are the first tool we use when we need action. They dropped the fact that during the bank holiday, FDR issued an executive order to close all the banks, which stopped the banks from collapsing actively and saved 125 million Americans, to the point they never responded to the argument. You know that the EO is the best tool to use and the first tool presidents use in times of crisis. They never respond to our 4 warrants on government functioning. Congress can't direct the bureaucracy. Congress can't fine-tune policy the way an executive order can. Congress can't provoke Congress to take action like an executive order can. And they can't create friction in our government. When they never respond to this, you already know that the executive order is imperative for our government to function, and that comes before all else. You always affirm.
Okay, so I'll just be going over the main points of contention in today's one. James Madison claimed that executive overreach was the downfall of democracy, and that is what we're seeing with executive orders. Just because one president uses one executive order, that doesn't mean that it's executive overreach. But when we see what's happening is the trend that's going down with people using this mechanism badly and decreasing trust in the public, that's what happens when democracy goes down. So, at the end of today's debate, you have to ask yourself which side upholds democracy better. And the answer is the negation. When we tell you that trust goes down by 73% because people don't like unilateral action. They have one response to this throughout the entire round. They tell you that people don't like Congress's policies. Clear difference. When you're arguing whether a policy is bad or not, or which the mechanism by which that policy came to be is bad. They're saying the policies are bad. That's like saying the policies that President Trump has passed is bad. That's different. Our evidence isolates that people find unilateral action to be bad, which critiques the mechanism by which executive orders are passed. So when you're looking at this debate of evidences, ours is the one you always preside by because ours actually critiques the way executive orders are passed, not the policies themselves. But then, what you have to understand is our impact is not just democracy, it's about trust. Ask yourself, in their own argument, during times of crisis, during times of things like COVID, when the government asks us to mandate masks, if people don't have trust in the government, when are we going to get better? If people don't have trust to reduce climate emissions, they won't do the things that the government asks them to do because that's what happens when you don't have trust in your government. Now, let's go to this crisis argument on their side. I need you to understand one thing. The National Emergencies Act allows the president to do every single benefit they tell you about. It allows them to pass things quickly, and it's better because there are checkbacks against it because Congress was the one that gave them power. And the reason it's not happening in the status quo is because obviously, if I have an easier option or an easier way out, I'm going to choose that. And that way out is executive orders, and because it's easier, it allows for these abuses, it allows for these lack of checkbacks. So we please urge you to preserve trust in democracy because not only does it solve for people's livelihoods, but also for the crises that they themselves talk about.